former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
This is it. The shouting is almost over, and Tuesday the nation will decide who should lead us for the next 4 years. Amidst those 6 most precious words in a democracy, the privacy of the voting booth. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and as always, heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Today we will cover the waterfront of election 2020. We'll consider the state of the race in the crucial battleground states, sort out the issues of greatest consequence to the voters, drill down on the growing scandal surrounding Joe Biden, and consider some larger issues like foreign policy and the differences or similarities between Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, and the question of whether this election will assure transformation or restoration. Plus, a development arguably of equal significance to the election over the long haul, the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. We'll be joined in our analysis by 2 of the sharpest minds from LibertyNation.com, political columnist Joe Schaeffer and legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off in this final pre-election show with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. The election finally is nigh, with polls in battleground states tightening as we count down to Tuesday. The question is whether that's a typical closing of party ranks late in most presidential races, or that President Trump has truly gained ground in those states he has to win to reach 270 electoral votes. Trump seems to have picked up his support in 2 crucial states, Florida and Pennsylvania, that he's been visiting with regularity as he crisscrosses the nation down the stretch at the same frenetic pace as 2016, with North Carolina and Arizona still in play, Michigan and Wisconsin showing Biden leading, but with poll results all over the place. Meanwhile, Joe Biden spent much of the last week of the campaign at or near his home in Delaware, perhaps because of a damning interview about his family's business dealings with foreign interests while he was vice president, which we'll discuss in a moment, but perhaps also to avoid making the kind of humiliating gaffe he made during a virtual appearance midweek.
What kind of country we're going to be. 4 more years of Georgia, he's going to find ourselves in a position where if Trump gets elected, we're going to be in a different world.
Now, no matter your ideology or your opinion of Donald Trump, a guy who wants to be the leader of the free world being unable to even remember the name of the current president and the man he's running against, confusing George Bush with Donald Trump, has to give you pause. Meanwhile, the VP candidate and presumed president-in-waiting, Kamala Harris, went on 60 Minutes and seemed to just lose her bearings when she was asked what kind of perspective she would offer to a President Biden.
Is that a socialist or progressive perspective?
No. No, it is the perspective of a woman who grew up a black child in America, who was also a prosecutor, who also has a mother who arrived here at the age of 19 from India, who also, likes hip hop. Like, what do you want to know?
Well, I want to give you that.
That is about the most uncomfortable laugh you will ever hear at just the wrong time. And more than that, a transparent giveaway of how uncomfortable she is answering that question about socialism honestly. But what could be the single biggest story or biggest scandal revolving around this presidential campaign is not even being covered by the media establishment. They're completely ignoring the testimony of former Biden family business partner Tony Bobilinski, who went on Fox News and described his reaction to the full-on media blackout of this explosive story.
Shocked, because it would be different if this was my word against Jim Biden, Hunter Biden, and Joe Biden.
Right.
That would be a very slippery slope, not something I would take the personal and family risk on it. But I've provided more documents and facts that validate times, meetings, who participated. It wasn't me generating. These text messages that I've provided are Hunter Biden in the first person, Jim Biden in the first person. It's not me generating the text messages, it's them speaking.
But what really got to Mr. Bobilinski was the bold-faced charge by Democrats that he is nothing more than a patsy for, who else? Russia.
Not only have they not gone on record, they've denied it, and they've tarred my family name and a long history of serving this country, and have other congressmen now talking about Russian disinformation.
This whole smear on Joe Biden comes from the Kremlin.
I held a top secret clearance from the NSA and the DOE. I served this country for 4 years in one of the most elite environments in the world, Naval Nuclear Power Training Command. And to have a congressman out there speaking about Russian disinformation, or Joe Biden at a public debate referencing Russian disinformation, when he knows he sat face to face with me, that I was traveled around the world with his son and his brother, to say that and associate that with my name is absolutely disgusting.
Indeed, the media has willingly sacrificed their last shred of integrity with their blackout of this story, but social media is just as bad. The heads of the big three tech giants were called on the carpet on Capitol Hill following their censorship of the Biden corruption story and grilled particularly hard by Senator Ted Cruz.
The three witnesses we have before this committee today collectively pose, I believe, the single greatest threat to free speech in America and the greatest threat we have to free and fair elections. Facebook is at the minimum at least trying to make some efforts in the direction of defending free speech. Google has more power than any company on the face of the planet. And the antitrust concerns are real. The impact of Google is profound. But today, I want to focus my questioning on Mr. Dorsey and on Twitter. Because of the three players before us, I think Twitter's conduct has by far been the most egregious. Mr. Dorsey, who the hell elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? And why do you persist in behaving as a Democratic super PAC, silencing views to the contrary of your political beliefs?
That Senate hearing produced no substantive promises or answers and no specific reform proposed, but this hard look at the liability protections afforded these big tech giants, shielding them from lawsuits, has only just begun. Finally, in a story of enormous consequence, lost in the sauce of a bitter presidential campaign was the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, signaling a sea change with the most progressive justice having died and been replaced by a conservative, assuring a constitutionalist majority on the court for as far as the eye can see. And after being sworn in, Justice Barrett used the occasion as a teachable moment for Americans about the Constitution.
It is the job of a senator to pursue her policy preferences. By contrast, it is the job of a judge to resist her policy preferences. This separation of duty from political preference is what makes the judiciary distinct among the three branches of government. The judicial oath captures the essence of the judicial duty. The rule of law must always control.
While ACB's keen mind and clear judicial philosophy is likely to have a profound effect on the court for years or decades to come, You also can't help notice how Justice Barrett is the very personification of the group Trump is so desperate to win back on Tuesday: white suburban women. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss what issues figure to be foremost in the minds of voters who've already cast their ballots or are preparing to do so on Tuesday.
Extra, read all about it. Election 2020 Big Bottom Flash Reports are coming. On election night, at the bottom of every hour, LibertyNation.com will give you Election Night 2020, 90 seconds at a time, with our Big Bottom Flash Reports. You'll get the drop with our one-stop shop. Tune into LibertyNation.com on election night for our Big Bottom Flash Reports, at the bottom of every hour. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The coronavirus pandemic, the economy, unemployment, healthcare, racism, urban violence, the Supreme Court. So many issues and so much for voters to process. Many have done such processing already, with tens of millions having already cast their ballots in this year like no other. Here for one final shot to review the bidding as we count down the hours to Tuesday is our old friend, LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer. Pleasure to have you back, Joe.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. So, Joe, what issue is most likely to animate voters the most? In ordinary years, it would probably be the economy. Well, what about the pandemic and health care and Trump's personality?
You know, I think you can just split it right along red-blue lines, because I just think that's how divided this country is. If you're on the red lines, Joe Biden's corruption, the Hunter Biden thing is right in your wheelhouse. This is why you voted for Donald Trump in 2016. This is why you want to vote for him again in 2020. So drain the swamp. Let's give him 4 more years to clean house. That is what's getting the Trump voters motivated. If you're a Biden voter, it's quite simply you don't like Donald Trump. It's anti-Trump. That's pretty much everything that Biden and even Kamala Harris have been running on. Yeah, they throw in the coronavirus every now and again, but it's mostly just to hit Donald Trump more than anything. What that means for undecided voters, I don't know, but I really don't think there's a lot of undecided voters. I think this cake is baked. I think people know where they stand for the most part in this country today.
Does the fact of the early vote actually benefit either party? Does the fact that more Democrats have voted up to now than Republicans hold any meaning? And does record absentee and mail-in voting change the actual nature of the election, or just the amount of time it'll take to count all the votes?
I think it helps the Democrats, if anything, their whole machinery of getting out the vote. This is not a guy who motivates you to get out and vote, Joe Biden. So they have to have a whole operation. And, you know, I think the average time of early voting is 22 days before the election. Well, look what happened with this Hunter Biden thing. It exploded, you know, within that window. Millions of people had already voted. And then this laptop bombshell comes along. You know, I don't know how much weight to put into this, but conservatives were saying there was a spike in Google searches for how do I change my vote. But, you know, even if that's not true or an exaggeration, it brings up a good point. You can't change your vote in a lot of these cases. And, you know, that's why I don't really like early voting that far out, maybe 4 or 5 days before the election. But so many things can still happen. The Hunter Biden thing did come along. So I do think it helps Democrats and it helps them with their organizing as well.
Well, due to the pandemic and people intensely worried about their own lives and futures, not to mention the outbreak of widespread urban violence, the killing of George Floyd, we've had a truncated presidential campaign, which didn't really start in earnest until a few weeks ago, and the candidates can't exactly campaign the way they usually do. Do you think that means these last days and hours leading up to Election Day hold more significance than in most years?
We're in a country now with so much turmoil, so much division and unrest. We're in 365-day-a-year campaign mode. It's going to keep going no matter who's elected president. The 2024 campaign starts in mid-January of 2021. It's ridiculous and it's crazy, but that's where we are. So based on that, to me, it's hard to say that, these last few days are crucial. I mean, we've been in a campaign war nonstop since Trump went down that escalator in the summer of 2015, it seems. And nothing's going to change no matter who wins. It's just going to keep going this way.
To what extent do we think that people voting for Joe Biden might actually be saying yes to a Kamala Harris presidency? And is that a plus or minus for Joe Biden?
I think that only works in the progressive blue circles, that urbanite environment that they've got locked up. You know, if you look at the electoral college maps, it's all the same. They've had that Northeast corridor, that Boston to Washington, D.C. corridor locked up. They've got the West Coast vote locked up. So, you know, it really comes down to, like it did in 2016, these Rust Belt states. And I just don't see who in those Rust Belt states are saying, gee, I want Kamala Harris. So I never understood why she was on the ticket in the first place. And I don't even think she's much of a factor unless people are scared off by her and saying, I don't want to vote for this. But helping Biden, I don't see how she helps Biden at this point.
What kind of personal theories do you have about the election which may not be common to most people?
Demographic change. I just don't think people are talking about it enough. If the Republicans are going to lose, that is going to be the overwhelming reason. If Donald Trump was to lose Florida, I would look at demographic change as the number one reason.
And if he loses Florida, he loses the election. That's pretty clear.
Absolutely.
So we can't let you go without your fearless election prediction, Joe, for both the popular vote and in the Electoral College. Be as precise as possible, please.
Well, I always looked at it. I think it's the same electoral map as 2016, where Biden needs to capture the Rust Belt just like Hillary, and Hillary failed. And the interesting thing is Democrats are trying to spin this. Like, oh, yeah, it is the same map, but Biden's outperforming Hillary. I don't see any reason to believe that. I see Biden underperforming. I see him losing Pennsylvania, losing Michigan. And to me, that wraps it up. I'm going to say it. I say Trump goes over 300 electoral college votes.
All right, Joe. Well, we'll weigh your prediction against the actual outcome next time we have you back. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Joe Schaeffer, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we'll return and give you some more to think about as you vote. The striking similarities between Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, the Trump foreign policy, and whether this election will represent transformation or restoration.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
With President Trump depicted by the media and pollsters as the unquestioned underdog in the 2020 election, this presidential race is increasingly bearing a remarkable resemblance to the political landscape surrounding the historic election of 2016. The media has again all but pre-written the story of Trump's defeat, and Democrats are ready to storm the White House and start measuring the drapes. If this sounds like a replay of 4 years ago, perhaps that's because of another striking similarity between 2016 and 2020. Trump's opponent. Yes, Joe Biden's of a different gender, more cognitively compromised, less shrill, and more somnambulistic than Hillary Clinton. Perhaps he surpassed Hillary's record low bar on favorability. But on the things that matter most, their establishment roots, worldview, prevailing ideology, and yes, the stain of thinly veiled influence peddling and official corruption, old Joe and Hillary are virtual carbon copies of each other. When Hillary received a congressional subpoena to hand over the contents of her controversial email accounts in 2016, she proceeded to delete some 33,000 emails and then physically destroy multiple devices which might have contained the remnants. This time around, we get mounting and increasingly irrefutable evidence that Trump's 2020 opponent used his own son as a de facto bagman for the big guy, Joe Biden. That Joe Biden stood by innocently as his entire family cut business deals in Russia, China, Ukraine, and elsewhere, as he raked in hefty sums off the top while he was serving as vice president. Sadly, the saga of these two candidates cut from the same cloth tells a larger tale, that such corruption, far from being the exception or an outlier, is widespread among career politicians who settle into the swamp and ultimately leave office far better off than when they arrived. Put another way, they come to the nation's capital ostensibly to do good, but instead do well. That was a driving force behind the historic victory of the first presidential candidate who could credibly claim and later prove that he was a true outsider, unbeholden to the deep-rooted money changers holding the levers of power in Washington. Donald Trump has delivered on much of what he so audaciously promised 4 years ago. And that means the stakes are even higher for Democrats still in a deep state of denial, appalled and incredulous that Trump not only won the election in 2016, but actually meant what he said during the campaign. It means the left will not again make the mistake of believing the American people could not possibly elect a man like Donald Trump. But it certainly does not mean there's any more than a dime's worth of difference between his enemy's twin messengers, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. But let's ask this question. What happens when a president is so successful with a particular issue that it no longer even merits discussion by the American people as he seeks re-election? What can you do if you are perversely a victim of your own success? How can you attract the attention of voters for policies of central importance that have been all but subsumed by a pandemic, raging urban violence, and Supreme Court drama? Thus is the state of the Trump foreign policy, which in ordinary times would be a significant theme in his re-election campaign. However, thanks not just to the deadly virus and civil unrest, but to the gloriously unaccountable Presidential Debate Commission, which wiped foreign policy entirely off their agenda, Americans have been provided scant opportunity to ponder how this president has navigated a perilous world order. But voters will inevitably evaluate at some level how Donald Trump has ushered in profound change in the way we deal with allies and adversaries alike. He's the first president in 30 years to reduce rather than escalate our involvement in foreign conflicts. He's the first chief executive to actually stand up to China. He wiped out the ISIS caliphate. He held to his explicit promise and that of his three predecessors to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the U.S. Embassy there. He achieved a level of peace in the Middle East previously thought unattainable, with not one or two, but three separate peace accords in recent weeks, the first in almost 30 years, involving Israel and their longtime enemies. Trump reintroduced the bedrock Reagan policy of peace through strength by rebuilding our flagging military to the point that no nation in its right mind would challenge our superiority. He tore up NAFTA and pushed the new USMCA across the finish line, removing some of the most gross inequities in the previous deal. He moved the goalposts on North Korea, discarding the multilateral talks which produced nothing for years, and replacing it with an audacious personal diplomacy which has brought things into an entirely new context and at least stalled the present nuclear threat posed by the world's definitive rogue regime. He discarded Obama's Iran nuclear deal and he withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. But what history should recognize as Trump's most seminal work, and clearly the most overlooked and underrated accomplishment of his administration, bridges the gap between foreign and domestic policy. Thanks in large part to his deregulation of a heavily regulated fossil fuel industry and the ongoing fracking revolution, the U.S. is, for the first time in over 60 years, energy independent, that carries with it two crucial assets: lower prices for everything from gas at the pump to fuel in your home, and an end to reliance on foreign energy and oil-driven wars. Even Trump-deranged leftists should applaud this new world free of foreign entanglements for the sake of oil, which they so loudly decried during the Bush 43 administration. But of course, they won't. That brings us to the same time-worn slogan we hear every 4 years. This is the most important election of our lifetime. And it's usually followed up by the words, "This time we really mean it." Each side believes the other is not just wrong, but tragically misguided to the point of evil. But is this election truly transformational, as so many have maintained? A Joe Biden presidency would certainly represent a radical departure from the last 4 years, but mostly it would resuscitate the oh-so-familiar political establishment placed rudely on life support by the electorate in 2016. The progressive forces backing the former vice president strictly as the face of the party until November 3rd, as opposed to its true leader, are rightly viewed as the would-be power behind a Biden throne. All of this, we're told, renders the 2020 election one of unparalleled consequence. We're led to believe that no matter the outcome, the American people will make a truly transformational decision between polar opposite futures. But hold on one second. After decades of conventional and increasingly reviled left-right party politics, was it not an unabashed anti-establishment pro-America populism which has already transformed American politics? Didn't the real transformation occur in 2016? A victory by either candidate in 2020 will hardly reshape the entire political landscape as it did in 2016. If Biden wins, we'd usher in a return of the same basic cast of characters from the 8 years of the Obama era. Familiar faces from Hillary Clinton to John Kerry to John Brennan would re-enter stage left, and a return to the days of establishment rule would be assured. And that would hardly qualify as transformational. Okay, be that as it may, you might say, Biden and the Democrats are different now, sold out to a party base openly calling for radical reforms. But remember the ultimate goal of all parties, all political parties, to win elections. Would Democrats really be able to pull off the to-do list of Bernie and AOC +3 and expect not to be crushed in 2022 and again in 2024? Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac for professional politicians, and they always have their eyes on the next race. Folks, the balkanization of red and blue America is already well in place and certain to continue no matter who wins this election. It'll only be a matter of degree. Worry, if you will, about whether your candidate and party prevails on Election Day or beyond. But whatever the outcome, the decision of the American people will be revealing. It will hopefully be decisive, and it will be of abiding significance. But one thing it's not likely to be is transformational. Quick break, and then we're back to talk Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court, and talking liberty.
Extra, read all about it. Election 2020 Big Bottom Flash Reports are coming. On election night, at the bottom of every hour, LibertyNation.com will give you Election Night 2020, 90 seconds at a time, with our Big Bottom Flash Reports. You'll get the drop with our one-stop shop. Tune into LibertyNation.com on election night for our Big Bottom Flash Reports at the bottom of every hour. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time for the ultimate segment of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It's when we welcome back our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and mostly the man we like to call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Well, I sure like it when you say it too, Tim. I'm great, and thank you for having me again.
Amy Coney Barrett ascends to the Supreme Court. This is a monster story which has been subsumed by the election and the pandemic and urban violence and all the rest. Tell me your thoughts about Amy Coney Barrett and the state of the Supreme Court right now.
Well, I think I sent you a message the night that they announced when the vote would take place. And I said, amidst all this other noise and just bombardment of other headlines in the news, this, I think, has the potential to be one of the most consequential events of 2020. So viewed in the hindsight of 10, 20 years from now, what are the big deals? I think this may be one of those big deals, Tim, because of what I foresee as Coney Barrett's rulings on major issues. We now have a situation where the Supreme Court of the United States functions almost like a super legislature, where they make rules about who can live or die, who can be killed or not killed, depending on how you see the abortion argument, whether you can have the right to keep and bear arms or not, quite literally the right to defend oneself. So many of these things are decided by one person's vote at the Supreme Court, and one of those people has changed, and in a big way, we think. And so that's it.
Now, the moment that Justice Barrett took the court, Justice Barrett joined the court, she was immediately faced with a couple of election mail-in ballot issues, and she did not participate in the voting on either one, both of which were favorable decisions for the Democrats. Why didn't she participate?
Well, I think all we can say so far about her participation is that it was that she did not participate as a result of a recusal. She hasn't said, I can't hear these cases because of a conflict of interest, real or perceived, or some other thing, right? All we know is that she didn't participate in them. So I presume that there is nothing nefarious. I suspect that, she's moving her many children and family to D.C. and managing all that, along with her work on the court, which does require substantial readings and hiring of clerks and all this other stuff. So it wouldn't be odd to hear later on that she said, no, I'm not able yet to hear cases as a member of the court because I still haven't, figured out where the bathrooms are.
Look, let me ask you this question. The court's now seen 3 mail-in ballot challenges from Republicans in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, but the decisions have been all over the map. The latest 2 favorable to the Democrats. What's the difference in the calculations of the court between these 3 states?
And that's right. The way to think about it is 3 states, not 3 decisions, because there's multiple cases and issues in each one at the state and federal level. So in Wisconsin, a federal judge ordered a change to the election law to add more days of counting ballots. And the Supreme Court struck that down. It was a 5-3 decision. Justice Roberts voting with the conservatives to say that it is wrong to change election rules this close to an election for a multitude of reasons, all the reasons that you don't need to be a fancy Supreme Court justice to understand, Tim. It sows wild confusion. It's impossible for local authorities to react and make changes to comport with the law. It's a recipe for disaster, and that's why they shouldn't do it. Now, by that same measure, Justice Roberts is loath to say to state authorities that they can't manage their own election affairs. And that includes by rulings from state Supreme Courts. So the other 2 states are Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And in Pennsylvania, that case involves a state Supreme Court and their unilateral rewriting of election law, and basically saying people can have more days to count ballots. In North Carolina, it wasn't the state Supreme Court, Tim, it was the State Board of Elections that decided to rewrite election law there and add more days to the counting of ballots. Now, All that said, I have to hasten to add, none of those things, and I know that it's kind of like, well, yeah, but it's going to be too little too late. But I think it's a very important point. The justices who have voted on the other side of these things haven't said that it's okay what the state election board or the state Supreme Court have done. They've just said that they're not willing to grant emergency relief on the issue to the other side. And so these things may come back to the court, Tim, the day after the election. I suspect we haven't seen the last of it.
Okay, let's go to your favorite place in the world, though you always make sure to add the rejoinder that it doesn't mean that you approve of the current city government there. But in Philadelphia, another incident of a black man being shot by cops, and riots ensued. And not a good time for Joe Biden. Urban violence springing up again in a critical swing state in a critical city, Philadelphia. But tell us about the shooting of Walter Williams and why it had to happen.
The cradle of liberty, Tim, is that is where these events went down, and it's not a good place to be now. And I think it's not a good place to be primarily because of the political leadership. The mayor there has decided to let rioters and looters run amok. I can't imagine why. In any case, the reason why the man had to be shot was because he had a knife on him and he was charging at police officers. And I just think that it's important I wish the city fathers would say this. I wish that the chief outlaw, that's not a pun, that's the name of the commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department, Ms. Outlaw. She should get out there and say to people, you cannot, no matter what, if you charge police officers with a knife and you're within, a certain distance, the danger zone, you're going to be shot. And that's because the police have no other option there, Tim. The option is to kill or be killed, quite literally, or suffer grievous bodily wounds, which no police officer can be asked to suffer for the community.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Scott Cosenza, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue with Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. And don't forget about our brand new Roku channel. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week when we may have a decision on the election. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.